Wire's on. So, and if you don't have the handout handy, we're going to be comparing the Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and we'll save the English because the English get their whole other thing because they're just a fun hot mess. Okay, so when we look at their past in the world, their past in your world history aspect. Okay. First of all, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they're both Catholic principalities that had to deal with the reconquest, with Spain being the more aggressive and the larger territory in the Iberian Peninsula. So, you basically have an Iberian feudal state that becomes a navigation power. In other words, okay, if you look at the Iberian Peninsula, it's not that big, there's not a lot of farmland, so how are you going to make a living? Well, you have to trade with other people. And so it's a feudal state that engages in navigational commerce.
What does Iberian feudal state mean?
Iberian is just the peninsula it's on. Okay. So Spain and Portugal occupy the space called the Iberian Peninsula. Feudal, and I'm going to get to feudalism as an aside because, okay, that was a good question. And I'm going to outline that over there. So navigational commerce, basically. Okay, feudal. Here's your basic idea. A feudal society is those old Middle Ages, that system where you have a lord who is a warrior elite providing physical protection from banditry, other hostile powers. Also, they impose justice by violence. So you have your lord who is you can think of these lords, yes, they're Christian knights, but they're also warlords. Okay, so you have this as a military elite. And then underneath you have, of course, supporting agricultural peasants. Okay? Now, your peasants typically are engaged in food production, typically grain. Now, one of the things that you're also going to want to pay attention to, both in the reading and in the lecture, is the nature of different types of farming. Farming is not just farming. How you farm one crop and what you get for it is very different from how you farm another one. So typically peasants, they're engaged in subsistence agriculture and they send their surplus to the lord in the form of, basically they're paying protection in grain. Okay? Now, that works for a bit until your population begins to outstrip your food supply. And so as the Iberian Peninsula stabilizes, Portugal has to resort to trade to gain goods, to gain prestige. So they engage in navigational commerce. Okay? Now, Spain, also an Iberian feudal state. Okay? They also get into navigation, but they become more on the mode of an empire. So, here we get into navigational imperialism, meaning that they use the sea to take their mode of having their warrior elite, setting up their, and you can use the term you want to use, you can use the term manor, you can use the term hacienda, you can use the term plantation, you can use whatever it is. Big farming thing where a whole bunch of people are doing the farming for a powerful military elite. Now, I use the term military elite because when you're a feudal lord or when you're a conquistador, part of the way that you enforce yourself is straight. You have the capacity of violence. You have the capacity of life and death. Everybody good so far? Okay. So the empire spreads out to, of course, what we now call Latin America. Again, you're starting with island of Hispaniola, then Cuba, then modern-day Mexico, and then into Central and South America. Okay? Central and South America. Now, a couple of things that begin to emerge. If I'm engaging in commerce, do I put down roots? Do I assimilate people in the same way if I'm just trading with them? No. If I'm setting up a hacienda, I am physically planting things in the ground. I am putting down roots, aren't I? Also, we see in the Spanish, you begin to see not only are they occupying land, they are also engaged in intermarriage. Let me move this out of the way, I'm sorry. So you have the various forms of intermarriage. And you may have observed in the text where the text talks about all the various racial groups of the Spanish intermarrying with the natives, the Spanish intermarrying with the Africans, the Spanish who are born here versus the Spanish who are born there. You saw those stratifications referenced, and if you haven't read that part already, you will in chapter 1. Okay, so they're putting down roots, literally and genetically. Right? Okay. Then you have the French. Now, France is kind of weird, insofar as, if you look at France for a moment, is most of France even coastal? No. Most of the bulk of France for the longest time was the breadbasket of Europe. Okay, France was the breadbasket of Europe going all the way back to, easily the 1st century BC. So here you have France, which is it's a feudal society, but it's a continental power. It's a continental power. Meaning it's not one of the great seafaring nation states. So if we look at the type of people who go and engage in a colonization, it's really not a colonization. When you're talking about the fur trade, it's resource extraction. If I'm engaged in resource extraction, how many of you know people who are like in the oil industry right now? Okay. And how many of them, they drive out to, or they'll either drive out or fly out to wherever the oil is, whether it's offshore, whether it's in another country, or whether it's here in certain parts. They're there for probably a certain number of days on, and then they're a certain number of days off. They don't put down roots if you're doing resource extraction. Okay, so the fur trade. Typically, and the metaphor is even more apt for those of you who know people who are working oil rigs. By the way, what type of people work in that resource extraction business now? Demographically, typically what gender? Male overwhelmingly. Typically young, because it's physically arduous. Typically not married. Right? Because, by the way, you're there and back again. That's hard on a family. Okay, if I look at who's engaged in the fur trade with the native peoples, it's typically young, unmarried men. Are they putting down roots? Some of them will intermarry with the native peoples, but by and large, even those who do intermarry with the native people, are they necessarily in these mixed ethnicity relationships? It's more like the Frenchman was adopted by the native person rather than this person imposing French society and French culture on the natives. So that's your fur trade. Now, a couple other things I want to get into. When we look at the French, they will start, the places that they occupy, you start with Canada, what is now the certain parts of Canada and the St. Lawrence River, and all the way down to, they set up some colonies later on down the Mississippi to what we would now call Louisiana. And actually the Louisiana territory was much larger than the state. And actually, I'm going to do this as kind of an aside. You even see this in the name of certain places. Okay, Louisiana was named after, okay, what's the famous French line of kings that kind of ends with the 16th one getting his head chopped off? Louis, Louisiana. Everybody sees that, yeah? By the way, start looking for the names of places because that's how you know who was in charge when the place got set up. I don't remember if this was probably Louis the 14th, maybe the 13th. The other one that was a real fun one, because we speak English and we mispronounce it all the time. Un, deux, trois, Detroit, the place of the three waters. So if you look at where Detroit is, it's in between three waters on the Great Lakes. And so you even see it in the names. And so it's kind of one of those funny little things. But again, they're focused mainly St. Lawrence River, Mississippi River up north. They're not creating large agricultural communities. They're not shifting their population. Okay. I'm going to get to the Dutch in just a moment. There's one thing I wanted to hit with the Portuguese. Well, no. I want to talk about the Spanish and the Portuguese together. Okay. So, both of these, the Portuguese and the Spanish, they're on the Iberian Peninsula. They're literally right next to each other. They're exploring. They're exploring the Western Hemisphere, and there's a concern, what could possibly go wrong if one primitive nation state sends its explorers, who are military personnel, out to the colonies, and they run into the other guy's people. What could possibly go wrong? War, right? And so the Spanish and the Portuguese, who are both Catholic countries, are facing the distinct possibility that their two exploration missions would precipitate an armed conflict that would then carry over back to the peninsula. So they had to make a deal. Okay? The deal between them, and by the way, if you're both Catholic countries, who's the infallible holy person that would make the best deal, the God-given deal? Who can make the deal for both the Portuguese and the Spanish? He lives in Italy right now. You may have heard of him. Starts with a P. The Pope. So the Pope makes what's called the Holy Demarcation Line in the Treaty of Tordesillas. So, Treaty of Tordesillas is the dividing line between... So basically, here's the Pope. He's like, okay, Spain, here's the line. You get one side of the line. Okay, Portugal, you get the other side of the line. And so, ironically enough, the line actually cuts through modern-day Brazil. So this is why Brazil is the only Portuguese-speaking nation in South America. So what you have happening is Portugal gets Brazil, and then goes east of the line. So this is why all the Portuguese colonies are Africa, or they get colonies in Africa. They go all the way to India. They will even make it all the way to China. Like they will have little trading outposts. So they will even make it to the one that's off the coast of China is called Macau. M-A-C-O-W. And so all of these are their trading outposts. Everybody good so far? Now, as a consequence of the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Spanish, they get that. They'll keep going, by the way, because, by the way, what's east of the east coast of what's west of the west coast? You keep going, right? Philippines. The Spanish Empire will eventually get to the Philippines. They're not there yet, but eventually they'll get there. So, in other words, the two powers actually, they demarcate at the Holy Line from the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Portuguese go east all the way to China, and then, of course, the Spanish go west all the way to the Philippines, and then, you run out of world, and also both of them as powers decline. But anyway, so that's their demarcation line. Okay. By the way, religiously, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the French They're all Catholic. Okay? Catholic. 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 The Dutch, on the other hand, are not Catholic. The Dutch, okay, and all right, so a couple of things I want to land out here. The Dutch is what we would call the people and the language group of the Netherlands. Okay? Now, the Netherlands were originally under Spanish dominion by virtue of, one of those feudal marriage deals. And I'm not going to delve into it greatly. But the Dutch gained their independence from Spain, and they established a series of, basically they established a series of states. And it's really closer to city-states. Amsterdam, of course, comes to mind. There are other principalities and states that they have. So first of all, if I look at them for a moment, they're not feudal. They're a seafaring people. Because, by the way, okay, if you look at the Netherlands, 1, it's cold, 2, most of it's underwater, and 3, it's mediocre fertile. But the thing that's actually interesting, it's seafaring and trade, and one of the things that's actually kind of interesting is they also gained some agricultural improvements before anybody else. And we're going to get into those agricultural improvements in just a moment. Okay. Concurrent to all of this exploration is some population dynamics that we need to keep in mind. Okay. You may recall yesterday we talked about how the Europeans had gained a number of foodstuffs from the Far East. What does it do to a population when health, nutrition, and food supply increase? Population goes up, right? Okay. I'm going to put something else on the board in just a moment, but I want to make sure everybody's got what they need from this bit. Going once, going twice. Also, I'm not opposed to people taking pictures. It's just don't turn me into a meme. That's occurred far too often. Some of them are quite priceless, but anyway. There's this one, I was pointing out a schedule like this, and it was as if I was the showman introducing and insert any number of things. My personal favorite was me going like this, and somebody had superimposed the decapitation of the French monarch, the execution of Louis XVI, and it looks like, and here it is. And, it was a pretty good meme. I was impressed. I wasn't horribly offended, but, Okay. All right, so this is something to keep in mind both during the reading and whatnot. Here we go. Okay. We won't get to the English in just a bit. Then we get to get into not just the English, but the Reformation, which is going to be fun. All right. So, all right. I want to say 17th century demographer, it was Malthus, posited that food supply grows linearly. Population grows exponentially. And it's probably easier to illustrate this with a chart because most of you probably would just as soon not remember Algebra 2. I was going to say, algebra is fun and math explains a lot of things, but if you had time to forget algebra, it's okay. So here's what I mean by linear. Okay. That's your food supply. In other words, you grow food, and food supply increases in a linear formation. population, okay. Now, I say this to humans who've lived in a world of reliable birth control. Prior to the world of reliable birth control, human populations increased exponentially. How many of you may have heard of one of your great-grandparents or your grandparents who had 8 kids? Okay, that's actually quite normal. Now, the thing that was kind of different is, okay, up and until, really the 20th century, it wasn't that unusual for a woman to have, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9, but not all of them make it. Because a fair number of them die of the various childhood diseases before the age of 5. Also, this is one of the reasons why you don't go to school until the age of 5, because why do you invest in a human who's not going to make it? Also, the school doesn't want to deal with you until you learn how to take care of basic bowel functions. Have you noticed that? All right. This is why my hat's off to kindergarten teachers, because occasionally they'll deal with a kid who literally loses their stuff. But anyway, so exponential is when you go 2, 4, 8, 16, and so it winds up looking like this. Well, of course, what happens is your population outstrips your food supply. This happens in animal populations, this happens in human populations. However, with human populations, the consequences are a little bit more varied. So when your population outstrips your food supply, you have what are called population checks. What a population check is the thing that puts the population back down into check. Okay, the population checks, the usual ones, and this is what Malthus posited: war, famine, pestilence, and flight. War, famine, pestilence, and flight. Okay. How would war address a population outstripping food supply? My group is hungry, your group is hungry, we duke it out to see who gets the food. That's your basic primitive war for resources idea. Okay. Famine. There's no food, people die of starvation. People die, population goes down. By the way, food production also goes down because you don't have the people to grow it, and cycle restarts. Does that make sense? Okay. Famine, people starve to death, population goes down, food supply goes down, new equilibrium reached. Pestilence, by the way, are healthy people. Who's more likely to get sick? Starving people or full people? Starving people. Okay. These are kind of related. Malthus doesn't appreciate the impact of flight. Now, I don't mean flight like a bird. I mean that people flee, they move. They migrate to places where they can either produce food or where food is available so that they don't die. We see this with refugees. We see this with migration in certain areas. Does that kind of make sense? Europe's facing a population increase. Europe itself is not getting larger. Can we look at the colonization process of the Europeans as an outmigration out of Europe to alleviate the population pressures because population has outstripped food supply? Concurrent to that, going back to what we talked about yesterday, because of the European diseases, what has happened to the population of native peoples? Decreased substantially. So remember, in the Americas, the native population, some estimates say it was reduced by 90%. Now, the other thing is, and I'll go back to, and on the break I'll probably bring that big bag of chips. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, you can summarize American history into 3 things: revivalist Christianity, the potato, and tobacco. You can use a potato to explain about, easily half this course. Potato is a New World food crop. Potatoes are taken back to Europe, where they're grown in England, the Germanys, and Eastern Europe. They do quite well there because it's cold, it's soggy, and potatoes like that, unlike wheat that gets moldy and upset. New food source. What happens to the population of the Europeans? They increase, they flee, they mass migrate into the Americas. This is why you have the migration waves that we're going to read about of the Irish, the Germans, and then later Eastern Europeans. Okay. That's the potato. Potatoes explain migration right there. Okay, so all those states are dealing with, all those European powers, starting with the Dutch and eventually getting to the English, are dealing with population pressures in the home country that is also a driver for those migrations, in addition to resource extraction. Everybody good so far? Okay. Questions on the reading before we get to the English bits? Okay. So the other thing I want you to keep an eye out for is when you start looking at war and flight, behind those wars, behind the flights, behind that you have population pressure typically from the old world. Okay. So let's go to... All right. This is... All right. You have a handout that has English history and the colonies in the world. Before we get to that, I want you to notice how the backside is blank. You probably are going to want to take a little space on the backside because we go and draw some family trees. Okay. Now, how many of you have a friend, or you might be that friend, who was like glued to the tube when Charles III of England was crowned? How many of you had the friend that watched that stuff? Okay, good. None of you found that interesting. Okay, how many of you at least know someone by reputation? They don't even have to be a friend, because there were some people who were like really on about that. No? All right. Okay, so
Those are handouts from today?
yes, they're right there. I'm sorry. Okay, here we go. Okay. Sorry about that. And here we go. All right, here we go. I'm going to do Spain, England, Scotland. All right. We're going to draw some intersecting family trees. Don't worry, there aren't that many loops. I know we're talking about royalty. Okay, I was going to make a royalty inbreeding joke. It just fell flat. Okay. Okay, so let's start off with people we know. Let's start with the Spanish people we know. We talked about this really cute couple the other day. Ferdinand and Isabella. We remember them, right? What do we remember about Isabella? She was the one that gave Columbus the money to go make his journey, right? Everybody, okay? Now, also, this is the two princes, monarchs, what have you, that create modern Spain. Remember, you had Aragon and Castile. They get married, they merge, they create modern Spain. Everybody good so far? They have a daughter. Catherine of Aragon. Okay? Now, contemporaneous to Catherine of Aragon, you have the British, and this is also listed on the front side of the handout. You see the first thing I got? It's called the War of the Roses. Everybody sees that? So the British have this really terrible period of what you would call a war of all against all. It's a dynastic feud. I mean, you thought people were upset when they couldn't call the election of whatever. Okay, these people were fighting over who gets to run England as a monarchy for 37 years. I mean, now think about that for a moment. 37 years of changing governments and perpetual warfare. Is that good for a country? No. So finally, the English settle on Henry Tudor, who is Henry VII. Now, some of you are thinking Henry VIII. Now, by the way, are there any of you who are a little fishy or who are a little sketchy on your Roman numerals? Okay. We'll just have that real quick. Okay, V is 5. 1 is 1. So 5 plus 1 plus 1. Don't worry, we're not going to get into 9s and 13s and whatever. We're going to stay in the single digits for this one. Okay. So Henry VII. Henry VII is the first king after England has been at war with itself for a generation. Everybody good so far? Okay. Henry's got 3 kids that matter. He has more, but we're only going to talk about the ones that matter. Now, by the way, you're Henry VII. You're trying to put your country back together after a dreadful civil war. So he has his first son, who is supposed to be the once and future king of England. He actually names his kid Arthur. That was the first kid. Names his kid basically to be a British Messiah. Okay? Now you may recall that you've never actually heard of a real King Arthur. There's a reason for that. Boy, don't make it. He's got Arthur. He has Henry. He's like, okay, I'm going to name the first kid the Messiah. I'm going to name the second kid after me. And then he has a daughter by the name of Margaret. So, Spain is an ascending power. They've just driven the Muslims off the continent. They've now begun their... they've driven the Muslims off the continent in 1492. By the 1500s, they're beginning to establish themselves as great colonial power. You're England. You just finished tearing yourself apart. You need some friends in the world. So, Henry VII... betrothed. To betroth means, okay, when my kid is old enough, he's going to get married to. Okay, you thought your parents were odd fixing you up in high school. No, these parents were fixing them up at 2. So the original plan was to have Arthur and Catherine get married and to create an alliance between England and Spain. Well, there's just one problem. Now, by the way, so and I have that on the chart. So 1509, Arthur dies. Wait, I want to say it's 1509. It could be a little off. Wait, no, I'm wrong. All right. Arthur dies. What do you do? Do you break the deal or you just change the players out? Marries the brother. That works. Now, a couple other things get thrown into the mix. Now remember, Arthur's the first son. Henry's the second son. Now, he didn't know he was going to, get the girl, get the kingdom, and get all that. So for most of his youth, is he being trained to be the king? No. Ironically enough, he was trained as a theologian, a religious scholar. Because, when you're England and when you're at peace, you don't need a second son for military conquest because, England, it hadn't quite gotten into the imperial game the way the Spanish had. So here's Henry, trained as a theologian. He gets married to Catherine, who's about 10 years his senior. He's young. I mean, okay, he's about 17 or so. He's late teens, early 20s. She's older. Okay. And they try to have a kid. And they do have a kid. So they have a kid. Mary. Now there's a problem. A little bit of a problem. Mary's not a man. Why is that a problem? She can't be king. Now, okay, and there's some determinism involved in some of the sexism. Okay, how many of you are like, oh my goodness, why can't we have a female monarch? Okay, by the way, has England had a female monarch in your lifetime? Oh, yes. She died this year recently. Elizabeth II, right? Okay, now think about this for a moment, ladies. What terrible thing that's necessary for the continuation of the species do women have to endure, and many of them used to die doing? Giving birth. So are you going to lay the control of the kingdom on your queen that might die as soon as the first heir is conceived? So, one, if I look at the feudal system, it's based on military violence. Again, not a profession suited to women at that time. And then also the risk of childbirth to the state. Okay, so this is a problem. And they try again. And at the risk of getting terribly grotesque, we know this kind of as a biological fact. As women get older, their ability to have and to carry children to term becomes more difficult, even more so when you're talking 1500s where nutrition's not that great and medical science is really dreadful. Right? What are they afraid of? Her dying, him dying. No one's running the country. Go back to the thing that occurs before the Tudor dynasty. What was it? Literally war out the countryside. They were abjectly terrified of a war of all against all, of a dynastic struggle. So, Henry, who's now Henry VIII, who was the defender of the faith, according to the Pope. Now, this is where life gets kind of funny. Okay, and this is kind of an aside. 1517. This is not really Spain. I just needed to put it somewhere. Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther. The Protestant Reformation, as an intellectual idea, it starts with Luther trying to reform the church from within, and then they break away. And part of what begins to happen when you look at the Reformation starts off in the Germanies. By the way, there's multiple Germanies at this point, in the German-speaking countries. So, Protestant Reformation, Luther has his theses, he's giving a critique of the church. Henry VIII writes a defense of the seven sacraments and is named Defender of the Faith. So that's 1517. Okay. They have Mary. They don't have any other children. Henry's thinking he needs a new woman because, this model is old and is not working the way it used to. And okay, yes, it's very sexist, but welcome to the times. Okay. And by the way, is there a degree of urgency when you're trying to stave off, civil war, basically? So in 1534, that's when the English Reformation occurs. Act of Supremacy. So, Parliament passes what is called the Act of Supremacy, but that's the beginning of the English Reformation. Now, what's very interesting, and I'm going to leave us well, no, we've got, okay, I got 8 minutes on that one. All right, the English Reformation. If I look at the English Reformation, it's not theological. It's political. Because the basic premise of the English Reformation and the Act of Supremacy is that the monarch is the head of the church in England. Whereas previously, who was considered to be the head of the church throughout the whole known world? The Pope. Okay? So if I look at this, if I look at the English Reformation, it is, and there goes gravity, that's fine, the king as the head of the church in England. Now, by the way, this also kind of works with other aspects of the English ethos. Okay, England's not connected to the continent. England is, the people are speaking a Germanic language versus, okay, if I look at Spanish, if I look at Portuguese, if I look at French, if I look at Italian, these are all Romance languages, yes.
So after the English Reformation, the king was the head of the church?
Correct. That's the basic crux of the English Reformation. because most of the institutions, the churches, the cathedrals, the bishops, the priests, the vicars, the deacons, all the same. You go to an Anglican church today, and after going to a Catholic church today, they will taste and smell very, very similar. And I do say taste and smell because, by the way, some of them still use the incense. Holy smokes, yes?
Are the Protestants like Christians?
Protestantism is a denomination, is a breakaway from Christianity. Actually, I'm okay, I got time for this. Well, a little bit. Okay. I can erase this bit, yeah. This is when in England they begin the process of de-Catholicizing themselves. Now, this is multi-generational. When you say the wiping out, really the wiping out of the Catholics in England is more or less complete. I would probably place it closer to 1680s. So we're talking from 1534 to 1680s. Now, there are periods when you have Catholic persecution and then the Catholics come back to power. But I would say as a permanent institution, the monarchy is finally secured with the Glorious Revolution. I'm going to get that. Yes, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're in 1534. But yes, that process begins here. But first, they have to define what's the difference between being an Anglican and what's the difference between being a Catholic. Whereas German Protestantism was a little bit more pronounced. Okay, so all right, and I'm going to go back in time a little bit. Okay, so. This is not in the course, but this is background. All right, so Christianity, okay. Before the formal establishment of the church, you have your first breakaway. You have the breakaway between the Orthodox churches and the Catholic churches. Okay, I should have done that the other way. Hang on. I'm going to tell you why in a moment. All right, here we go. So you got the Catholic churches and the Orthodox churches. West, east. So Orthodox churches, you still see them today. You've got the Greek Orthodox, the Russian Orthodox, Chaldeans, Coptics, etc. Okay, this is backdrop. This is not going to be on the test, but I wanted to do that. In the West, you had the Catholic churches. This is, again, the one that's centered on Rome. Then Catholicism breaks up into... You can look at Western Christianity. Catholicism or your Lutheranism breaks off over here. In other words, it breaks off the Catholic Church here. Now, some people are going to want to say that the English Reformation comes off of that. I don't, because there are too many forms that are the same. I would probably say that this is another offshoot. So you have Anglicanism. And then from the English breakaway, you begin to have other Protestant denominations, where this is where we're going to get the Presbyterians. Later, you're going to get the Baptists. Later, you're going to get the Methodists. Even many of the common Protestant religious denominations today, a lot of them you can think of as intellectual offshoots of Anglicanism. And you can even look at the Reformation in many ways as a linguistic revolt. If you look at the places that stay Catholic, it's typically the places that speak a Romance language, Italian, French, Spanish, Romanian, versus the countries that tend to break off into Protestantism. They are your Norse countries, some of your Germanys, and then, of course, the English, and eventually the Scottish. The Irish don't. They speak Gaelic. But anyway, so you can even look at it. You can look at it as a theological dispute. You can look at it as an ethnic dispute. Or you can look at it as a linguistic dispute. And, okay, Henry becomes the head of the English church, divorces his first wife, marries Anne Boleyn, and they have another kid. Henry and Anne, we're going to put Anne over here. They have Elizabeth. So, after breaking away from the English church, after breaking away from the Catholic Church and all these tumults and all these travails, what's it got to show for it? Another girl. Okay, things didn't go so well with that one. So, Anne Boleyn gets into a little bit of trouble. She is found to be in adultery, put on trial both for adultery and for treason, because, by the way, if you cat around on the monarch, that's a high crime. And off with her head it went. So then he gets a third wife. Oh, by the way, I'm going to get to Margaret in just a moment. She's a surprise tool for later. Don't worry, her story's short. Sorry. Okay, so then he gets a third wife, Jane Seymour. Gets the son, Edward. He finally gets a boy, Edward VI. This is a good place. This is a good place for us to pause, I think, because, you know, okay, Henry's happy, gets the third kid. By the way, poor Jane died in childbirth. Remember I said what's one of the reasons why maybe having a female monarch might be a bit of a problem? Death in childbirth was quite common. Okay, let me tell. Okay, how many of you know somebody who's recently had a kid, like in the past 5 years? Okay, and they made it, right? Because they went to, and I'm willing to bet that most of them went to hospital. Okay, there are people who still do births at home. Death in childbirth was common enough that you would know someone in your extended family who had died. I think it's like 1 in 12. So that's pretty high. So, Jane dies. Edward is a prince. Henry's happy. And this is going to be a good place to stop. I figure we'll do a 5-minute break and we'll come back at 12:20 and then we'll pick up.
Were they all super young? Because I know in chapter 2 there's one who was like 20 years old.
Yes. Edward is king at a very young age.
Died like at 20 or 17.
Yeah, he died young. He barely, he had a very short reign. I'm going to pick up with Edward VI and then the succession to Mary after the break.